Thank you to His Royal Highness Princess Salma bin Talal, and thank you to INSS Senior Fellow Dr. Oded Aran, who conducted the interview. And as I'm sure many of you know, Dr. Oded Aran used to be the Israeli ambassador to Jordan. And now I would like to invite all our panelists to join me on stage so we can continue with the second part of the panel. So if Udi can get back on stage, and then I would also like to call Brigadier General Michael Herzog and Professor Asher Sasser. If you're in the audience, please join me on stage. And our two panelists today really do need no introduction, so I'm just going to mention their names briefly again. And first, we're going to hear from Brigadier General Michael Herzog, who is now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he's the Milton Fine International Fellow. And after, we're going to hear from Professor Asher Sasser, who's, of course, at Tel Aviv University, both a professor at Tel Aviv University as well as a senior fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Thank you.
Good morning. The INS presentation that was shown here characterizes the situation in the region and its implications quite well. I would like to make several comments, though, about this presentation and its conclusions that, in my opinion, are slightly overly optimistic. What we see here in our region is a volcanic eruption of Islamic and popular revolutions. We see increasing conflicts between Islamic and nationalist secular groups, and we see increased tension between the Sunni and the Shi'i parties. We see this occurs in every area where the two families encounter each other: in Iraq, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, where the Shi'i population is approximately 10%, in Kuwait, and in the wider perspective between Iran and the Central Sunnian countries. One interesting exception to this conflict, which is one of the most dramatic characteristics of the region, of the Sunni-Shi'i conflict in the Middle East today, is the Hamas, which enjoys a political and financial umbrella from the Sunni countries such as Egypt and Qatar. And on the other hand, the conflict with Israel continues to receive support and ammunition from Iran. It enjoys its relationship with both sides. It is this eruption of energies, these revolutions, this increased tension in the region, and the financial crisis that has been mentioned does weaken the political framework in the region, increases Islamization and leads to atomization as well. The energies that have erupted in the region can be divided into three. There is the popular energy, the street, the general population, which has basic needs such as finance, respect, employment, hope, etc. But in parallel, there is what is known as the Arab Spring. There are two other forces that are much less sympathetic. One is the Muslim Brothers, where they have took control in certain places. They have taken control, such as in Egypt and Tunis. And the other aspect is the jihad and Islam forces. And those who thought that after Bin Laden was executed, then that those elements were overcome. We still see that these groups are flourishing in places such as Libya and other countries in the region, where we saw an American ambassador being killed. We see these forces in Gaza and in Sinai. We see them in Jordan and in Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra is the armed forces of the most talented armed forces. We've seen them in Iraq, where the number of terrorist attacks has doubled. And these forces that are relatively more stable, the Sunni countries such as Turkey and Qatar support Islamist components, or Syria, which creates a complex problem for the United States and for Israel, because these are forces that are on the one hand they cooperate with the United States in their operations against Iran and their battles against Al-Qaeda and their war against international terrorism, but they have anti-American and anti-Israeli interests. They support these interests by supporting the Muslim Brothers and other jihad and the jihad. They support the Palestinian Authority. They have promised they have not supplied a single dollar to the Palestinian Authority when it was on the verge of collapse. Abu Mazen spent 5 days trying to convince the ruler of Qatar and Mohammed Morsi and was unsuccessful. Only it took days to convince them to transfer funds. Syria supports Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian Authority. We saw the response of the state controller there. They support the Islamic forces at the expense of the secular nationalist forces, which creates a very problematic situation. These powers, such as Qatar, that have the money, they try to use their funds to buy political influence. I can give you an example that President Hassan mentioned Qatar's financial influence. Qatar invests billions of dollars in Egypt in order to purchase influence in that region. $3 million on state bonds, and another $18 billion that they have committed to invest in financial developments within Egypt. They use these funds to purchase, to acquire influence. The questions have been raised in Egypt whether Qatar is humiliating them by trying to purchase influence to such a great extent in Egypt. It is true, as it has been mentioned, that the military threat from our neighboring and hostile countries has decreased significantly. Not that it was dominant over the past years, but the threat has certainly decreased. But I think that a situation in which Israel is surrounded by dysfunctional countries that are involved in internal conflicts create very complex situation for Israel. There is no clear address. There's no specific person that we can contact to talk to or to fight against, which creates a complicated situation. It creates security challenges. We discussed the strategic weapons that are held by different authorities in the region. There are huge supplies in Syria, both conventional, strategic, and chemical weapons. Significant, very large numbers that can fall into the wrong hands, whether it's Hezbollah or Islamist forces in Syria, and they can be aimed at us. This can create very difficult dilemmas for Israel. We face the difficult dilemma with the situation in Sinai. Egypt does not have sufficient control over Sinai, though we have a peace agreement with Egypt. The Egyptians do not control Sinai, and the terrorist activities there cause sensitive situations. A terrorist attack from Sinai might force us to retaliate, which can endanger our relationship with Egypt. I think that the region is full of groups and authorities that we cannot communicate with, which creates problems for Israel. The fact, for example, that we have a peace agreement with Egypt that we will want to maintain and not to harm was one of the considerations, not the only consideration, but one of the considerations that caused Israel not to enter Gaza during the Pillar of Defense operation. This created a difficult dilemma of enforcing military power, and there might be situations in which we will have to explicitly fight against organizations. An operation in Gaza or an attack in Iran might eventually be necessary, but these situations create complex dilemmas for us. I think that Israel has a problem of dialogue with countries, with movements that have developed during the Arab Spring, whether it's the community or the Islamic forces. If we take Egypt as an example, we certainly have a good open dialogue with the security forces in Egypt, but we don't have good political connections. Musi has never mentioned Israel. I think that if the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, called the President of Egypt, he would not accept the call. He said that he will not talk to the Prime Minister until Israel makes peace with the Palestinians. When negotiations for ceasefires began at the end of the Operation Pillar of Defense, Israel had no direct communication with Egypt. When the communications failed, the Israelis included the American politicians, and only through them were we able to reach a ceasefire agreement. We have open communication, open dialogue with Jordan that we must maintain. We have the ability to develop dialogue with minority groups such as the Kurdic groups in Iraq and in autonomous regions that have been established within Syria, and those who strive for historical agreements with Turkey. I would just want to remind all of us that in the end, our dialogue with minority groups has only a limited effect, and our real challenge is to develop communication channels with the leaders in the region, which is a very difficult task. We have difficult relationship with Turkey right now. The relationship it is improving, but it will not be restored to what it was before. Turkey has changed its orientation over the past decade, and there are different components that could cause rifts between us, and the relationship between our countries will not be restored to what it was previously. As long as the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians continue, we will not be able to communicate with other leaders. There is we still have communication channels with the Palestinians despite all of the limitations. That is really the only place where there is potential dialogue that has not been taken advantage of as much as it should be. And although the conventional military threat has decreased, I think that Israel has to invest more in the attempt to create more advanced dialogue with the Palestinians. I don't want to get into that right now, but I know that we have to invest more efforts. The Palestinians are actually one of the only groups in the region that has not undergone an Arab Spring, but that doesn't mean that it will not happen in the future. It can be expressed, among other things, by significant deterioration in Palestinian relationship with Israel if there will not be developments in our relationship. I agree with what was presented here, that Israel has to prepare itself for the current situation against against Palestinian terror, but if we want to conduct significant operations in the region, the current situation in the neighboring countries gives us very little room to maneuver. I think that Israel's potential value for the United States is increasing as a stable, democratic country within an unstable region. But we must realize that we cannot take this for granted, and it depends on our ability to take full advantage of our good relationships with the United States, and not to be seen as harmful to them.